So the food that we're eating and the way we get that food is regulated. And it's actually regulated by a lot of different government agencies. And each agency does something a little different. Now you've probably heard of all of these government agencies, but more than likely you didn't know who was covering what when it came to agriculture. And the common theme with these regulatory agencies is to ensure that one, farmers are making enough money so that they can keep providing us food, and then also to make sure that our food is safe. They're also going to help regulate new technologies and the chemicals that are used in our agriculture. So let's talk about each of these government agencies. So the first one is the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency. We're going to learn a lot more about them, particularly in our water unit, since they're going to regulate a lot of processes that ensure that we get clean drinking water. But they're also regulating agriculture, and it's kind of for a similar way. It's to make sure the environment is being protected. So for one thing, they're looking at the chemicals that farmers are using. And the two major chemicals that farmers use are pesticides and fertilizers. And we're going to talk a lot more about each of those in this unit. And what they want to look at is the safety of these pesticides and fertilizers, not just for the farmers, but really for the environment. Are they going to kill what they say they're going to kill? Do they kill other things? How easily do they get into the environment? If they get into the environment, do they break down? So they're looking at all aspects of these pesticides and of these fertilizers to deem whether or not they are safe for our environment. And the reason, particularly with fertilizers, pesticides kind of make sense. We know pesticides are there to kill other organisms. But the EPA is also looking at fertilizers not because it kills organisms, but because it can run off into our water bodies. Pesticides can run off into our water bodies as well. So not only from rainstorms like we see in this picture, but also just watering plants. The chemicals that we put on those plants could potentially wash off when farmers are watering them. And then they enter a water body, and more or less that water body flows into another water body, into another one, into another one. And so the chemicals that may have washed off a farm can have negative impacts on not just the water near that farm, but the water that a lot of organisms, including humans, rely on. So it's the EPA's job to kind of determine what impacts do these chemicals have, particularly on water ecosystems. Now, each of these organizations that we're going to talk about are going to regulate some aspect of GMOs. We'll talk more about GMOs in this unit, but quite simply, GMOs are taking the DNA of one organism and putting it in another organism, typically to get bigger, better, and a lot more of whatever produce we're trying to create. So what the EPA looks at is GMOs that have been specifically engineered, specifically made to incorporate or create a resistance to pests. So for example, if you have a corn that we insert a gene that makes it more or less make its own pesticide, it's still a pesticide. It's still impacting organisms in the environment. So the EPA would investigate that GMO to make sure that that pesticide that corn makes isn't overtly hurting the environment other than what it was designed for. Similarly, and we'll talk about this more in our GMO section, but we might make corn, make it so that it doesn't die if we spray a chemical on it. So we want that chemical to kill all these other plants, but we don't want to kill our corn. So because we're dealing with pesticides, EPA is like, okay, let's investigate this GMO more just to make sure there's no negative impacts to the environment. So they're still looking at chemicals, just in this case, chemicals that are incorporated into the plant. So that can kind of make it a little bit easier to remember what the EPA is looking at when it comes to GMOs. Another organization, probably the most important one, it's literally in their name, is the USDA, and they are the United States Department of Agriculture. And the USDA does a lot of things. Their major goal, though, is working with farmers and working for farmers. So one of the big things they do is they help subsidize farmers. So the reason we subsidize companies, we the government and taxpayers give money to certain, I guess, professions, such as farming, so that if making food isn't profitable, farmers might be like, well, I'm not going to farm anymore. I can make more money doing something else. So the government provides money to these guys to essentially ensure that they keep producing food. Or they're producing money so that they can lower the cost of food because the farmers have another source of income. This in turn helps us, the consumer, because it keeps food prices down. They also help to educate farmers. And by educate, I mean things like, what are the best practices to manage your soil? How can we reduce the amount of pesticides or fertilizers you're using? So they're doing tons of workshops and seminars, creating lots of educational materials exclusively for farmers to ensure their success. And again, this isn't just great for farmers, it's great for us, for people. We're the ones consuming the goods that they're creating. The USDA is also the regulatory agency that does all of the organic food labeling. We're going to talk more about food labeling later on in this unit, but they're the ones in charge of that. And then the USDA is also known for meat and the regulation that they have around meat products. So the USDA, when it comes to regulation, is looking at food safety. So making sure that the eggs that we're eating, that the chicken breasts that we're eating, that the ground beef that we're eating is safe for consumption. The USDA will check those products multiple times. It could be anywhere from 1 to 3 times. They'll go to the individual farms and see the conditions of the animals. They may go to the meat processing plant to see the factory, see the processing of those meat products, and they may even go to individual grocery stores to inspect meat. So they can inspect it anywhere along the line, and they usually do it at least once somewhere in that production line. But this is exclusively meat. We do have one more organization that's going to do everything else. Now, when it comes to GMOs, remember, the United States Department of Agriculture is for the farmer. Wants to make sure that the farmer has more or less the easiest time possible at making food. So the USDA is going to look at GMOs that may potentially impede the farmer's chance of being successful. So particularly in GMOs, we make them so that they are sterile because we don't want the pollen of a GMO plant to potentially pollinate a weed. So for example, some GMOs, as I mentioned with the EPA slide, some GMOs incorporate a way to not die from a chemical. So that farmers can spray a chemical across their entire farm. It will kill everything but that corn. We want to keep that corn alive. But wouldn't it be really unfortunate if that GMO corn bred with a weed species? And if it breeds with a weed species, it'll make this weed offspring that now can't die to pesticides because it has that GMO gene in it. So what the USDA is doing is they want to make sure that the GMOs that are being created cannot breed with plant pests, particularly can't breed with other weed species. Because plants can hybridize very easily. So they want to make sure that no breeding is going to happen because they want to ensure that the farmer doesn't have to now deal with weeds that they can't kill. So again, it's all related back to farmer success and inadvertently, or maybe advertently, to the success of our country because of the production of food that we have. Now we have one more organization. That's the FDA. The FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. And in general, what this organization does is they just look at the safety of stuff. And I use the word stuff because it's a whole bunch of things. Pretty much anything that humans can ingest or they put on themselves, the FDA is going to look at the safety of that. So for example, medicines, that's the drug part of food and drug. Any kind of medicines, whether it's prescription medicines or whether it's over the counter. They're going to look at something like bottled water, something you buy in the grocery store. They'll look at things such as cosmetics. This doesn't mean just makeup. This is also meaning things like toothpaste, shampoo, deodorant. So things that you're using every single day. And then also looking at the safety of cigarettes. I just throw this in here because I find it kind of funny, because they've shown over and over again that it's not safe, but they regulate that anyway. But what they are regulating is, say, warning labels. Same with alcohol. It says pregnant people shouldn't drink this. Pregnant people shouldn't smoke this. So even if they're making the decision, yes, we can sell it to the consumer, we need to have the appropriate labeling to let the consumer know what they are consuming and the potential dangers of that. Now, we're not going to talk about all the different things that the FDA regulates because we're talking about agriculture. We're talking about our food. So we said the USDA is going to regulate meat items, but the FDA is going to look at everything else. It's going to look at those fruit popsicles. It's going to look at your cheese pizza. It's going to look at your bags of lettuce that you purchase. But the thing is that because the FDA has to regulate the safety of so many things, there's a lot more non-meat products than meat products, and they're also regulating the safety of every single thing that can be sold more or less in a grocery store. There's a lot more things sold in the grocery store other than food products. And because of all the things that they have to regulate, it is very rare that food items get checked for safety, whether it's at the farm, whether it's at the production plant, whether it's in the grocery store. The FDA is spread way too thin in order to be as rigorous as the USDA is with meat products. Now, the times we know, or the times we see the FDA stepping in, is with recalls. They're the ones that issue the recalls on romaine lettuce. They're the ones that issue the recalls on peanut butter. But it doesn't come around until people have already started to get sick. If people get sick with salmonella, if people get sick with food poisoning, it gets reported to a local health department and moves its way up to the FDA. And then the FDA steps in and says, hey, guys, let's figure out where this is happening. Let's recall everything. Let's not sell this product until we know what's going on. So I know I talk a lot about, oh, being a vegetarian helps in this way. Well, being a meatitarian, you're more likely to be safe just because your food's checked a lot more. So let's relate this to GMOs. GMOs are going to take a look, or the FDA is going to take a look at GMOs just to see if they're safe. Are they safe for humans to consume? If we develop a new apple that grows 2 times bigger, is that okay? Is that still a safe apple for us to consume? So they're still looking at the same thing. They're still looking at food safety. But in this case, they're just looking at whatever type of GMO it is it okay for us to consume? Is it going to make us sick? Is it going to be okay short term? Is it going to be okay long term? And we'll actually answer that question a little bit later on in this unit. So again, we have 3 major regulatory agencies that are looking at the production of our crops. We have the USDA that does organic food labeling and looks at the safety of meat. We have the EPA that's really looking to make sure that the farming practices we do are not harming or are having a minimal impact on our environment. And then we also have the FDA that's going to look at the food safety of everything that is not meat related. So just know that when you're going to the grocery store that most, or maybe some of the things you're looking at have been deemed safe. Now, don't think of this as the end of the world, right? You have been eating food for 20, 30, 40, maybe 50 years. And the number of items that you ate that have been personally inspected by someone is actually fairly low. So don't think, oh, the FDA is not looking at this canned soup, that means I'm going to get sick. That's not what that means. It's more likely than maybe a meat product. But keep in mind that it's company's best interest to not make you sick. If Jif peanut butter was going on recall every other month, the amount of people who would buy Jif peanut butter would probably severely drop. So although a government agency may not be coming in and really taking a look at every single item that you consume, just keep in mind, capitalism in this case kind of works for us. Companies want to make sure you keep buying their product. Well, to ensure that happens, they need to make sure they don't make you sick.